Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things, in that it's actually going to be the first of the 30k in 30 days collection. This one here is the Mark II Centurion from the Saturnine box set, and with this fella what I'm going to do is show you all of the technique, start to finish, on how I'm going to paint this entire army. Now, this fella, there was a bit of a glitch with the video, unfortunately, so the first half of this is going to be with a similar miniature. I did lose the first half of the thing, but we overcome, we adapt, we find a better way of fixing things. Don't worry, all of the cool bits are going to be on this miniature here. So I'm going to be using the Quick Shade Dip and other products from the Army Painter for this one, as they have kindly sponsored the Army to make this video series possible. So thank you very much goes to them. So all of the paints for it will be listed in the description. Same as always, let's get started. Now, luckily, at the very least, this fella has most of the details that the Centurion actually has on him, so I'll be able to demonstrate on this guy instead. Bit of a sod, but we'll make do. Now, obviously, I've started off by priming the miniature, and here I like to do things in two steps. Start with a spray of matte black, and pretty much cover from the bottom up with that. Don't worry too much if you're not getting it completely across the top. And then I've hit him from roughly 45 degrees with some brain matter beige. Now, a couple of light passes of that, same as if you were painting it from the pot, is going to be better than just handing it in place and really filling in the detail. It's up to you how much of that you really apply. I have been a little sparing on the back just so that you can see the difference between, smooth and rough, because I like texture. In my 30k stuff, the Heresy, to my mind, always has a little bit, it's a bit more gritty and textured than you would see in smooth Primaris Marines and stuff like that. So that's a good place to start. Now, for you miniatures who are wearing capes or cloaks, I tend to find that's the easiest place to start. So what I'm going to do is go ahead, I've got my monster brush here, and I'm going to load it up with Noble Skin. Now, really bucket it on there. And let's go ahead. I tend to find it's always easiest to apply too much, and while it's still wet, quickly wiggle it into where it needs to go. So paying attention, particularly in these deep folds on the back here, you'll get quite a lot of Noble Skin settle there. But you can shift it around. And I'm going to paint the interior of the cloak with this as well. Now, once that has dried, you'll get something that looks like this. And I really like that finish. Once it is thoroughly dried, you get this almost velvet kind of look to things. It's a little more speckly on camera than it is in reality, but that's a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like. However, let's flip them around here. Grab this time some orc skin, and we're going to apply this over the top of the noble skin. Now, it'll look dreadful going on, as is often the case with some of these speed paint colors, but trust the process, and believe me, this will look really cool when it's done. Now, if you've got a fellow whose cloak has trim or little bits of filigree or anything like that, what you can do is, as you're applying these, just try and leave the original color, the primer, still showing there. And then that dries, well, almost dries, nice and smooth. What I've got now is Dusk Red, and this one's really only going to show up on any of the guys that have these little hanging leather bits. I can never remember the pronunciation of it, if it's Terouge or Petugarugi, these bits. Load up your brush, and with Dusk Red, fill them in. If you want to, once this first coat's gone on, you can give it a second to make the color a little more solid. But I would suggest you probably won't need to. By the time we dip this, it's going to darken that down quite a bit. Now, once that has dried, I'm going to end up with a few little bits which I need to tidy up with some brain matter beige from the pot. I'd recommend ordinarily save this step once you put all of your speed paints on. But because I am going to be applying speed paint gold over the top of some of these bits, I need to do this stage now. You'll probably find on your bulk infantry that you won't need to do this tidy up step because we aren't popping the Dusk Red on. But if you do, just a little bit of paint from the pot, nice and simple. Now here's where we get to what's going to be on pretty much everybody, and we're starting with broadsword silver here. What I'm going to do is a relatively thick coat of this. You do really want to chuck it on so that it settles nice and solid. And any bits that are going to be an acrylic later, so for example on the combi bolter here, don't worry at all if I'm going to hit the bits that are going to be black, because I'm going to paint those with matte black rather than a speed paint. So any mistakes I'll be able to cover up. Now over the weapons and what have you, that will work perfectly well. It is a good idea if you get a little bit of the primer still showing through, like right at the edges, just go back over with a little bit more as that's settling. It will darken down quite nicely. Now on the little ends of the leather dangly bits, you will find that broadsword silver tends to like to travel into gaps and crevices, so it can get a little sticky in there. Don't worry about that too much, because when we go ahead and dip this, it's going to cover over a lot of that without really, you're not going to see it. If you do prefer to be tidy though, then I'd suggest you can just save that step and use plate mail metal on those little bits instead. But what we're going to use next is Hoplite Gold, and this is pretty much the basis for the color scheme. Now I cannot wait for the marker version of this to come out. This is going to be so much easier. But for now, a wee bit of brushwork will not take long at all. Same as before, if you find there's any bits where you're getting a little of that bony color still showing through, just come back and give it another quick swipe with your brush. And yeah, on your basic Marines, this is not going to take so long. On your characters, well, they tend to be wearing quite a bit of bling, so this can be a slightly more involved process on these guys. You see what I mean? That is a lot of gold. On the Legionaries, it tends to be just the shoulder pad trim, because like I have said before, the fellas that you see in the rulebook, they've just got a little bit of green on their shoulder pads and some gold there too. Even the Mark III guys don't tend to paint their trim, so that's kind of handy for speed painting Death Guard. Well, moving on to our typical acrylics here, and I've got some camouflage green. This is my choice for the Death Guard sort of sickly green, but you can pick one that you like the look of. Just remember that it will be a little bit darker once it is dipped. So as mentioned, I am going to use matte black here to tidy up the weapon casings. And then the last of the base coats that we're going to apply is a little bit of Dorado skin. Now this is quite light, and when it is dipped or shaded, it's going to look properly sickly, is the only word for it. It does go a really grimy, grotty brown, and he does not look well as a result, which suits me just fine for my grubby little Death Guard chap. Now at this stage, that is all of the base coats done. What I'd suggest is grab yourself some Brain Matter Beige if you need it, and do any little odd bits of tidy up on the white armor if that's necessary. What I am going to do now is to actually take him outside and hit him with a satin varnish. Now there's a couple of reasons for this. If I had a gloss varnish, I'd use that one instead. But I don't, so I'm going to use satin. It's got a smoother finish to it than a matte varnish would. And what I'm using this for is to protect the speed paint that I've already applied from the dip as I apply it. Now the dip by itself isn't particularly aggressive, but I have found that the way that I apply it can sometimes lift a little bit of the speed paint right off the edges and corners and high points of the miniature. So, bit of a downside if you're as aggressive with your brush as I am. Easy way to prevent that though is to just varnish it now. So that's what I'm going to do. Now once that varnish has dried, it's time to prep up your strong tone. Now, the first mistake you're going to make is to shake these containers. Don't do that. Better thing to do is to let them settle and sit for a while, and then slowly lever off the lid. The reason being is if you shake them up, you're going to get dip, which sits up and collects on the underside of the lip to the lid itself, and then you get this horrible gunky stuff which will prevent it from closing properly. So take your time here, crack this open, and then lift it carefully away, and just pop it on a bit of kitchen towel set aside for that. Now I have got a little bit of that on the inside of the rim there, so let's just wipe that out. Now over time, if you do get any gunk collect around the inside of the lip, just wipe it out with an old brush or something first of all, and get rid of it on some kitchen towel. You don't want to mix that into your dip. And then to mix it up, again, old brush will do the job. Just start stirring it. You'll see very quickly it goes from this oily, sort of translucent stuff on the top to an almost chocolatey brown sort of color. It's actually quite pleasant. Smells wonderful, but you don't ingest it. Don't wiggle it around too much, otherwise you'll end up splashing it everywhere. And make sure that you're running your brush backwards and forwards across the bottom a couple of times just to get all of the gunk off the bottom and mixed in thoroughly. You'll be able to tell that your dip is properly mixed when there's no oily streaks in the top surface there. So a nice solid color, we're ready to go. What I've got is a grubby old brush from the stationery aisle. These things are brilliant, nice and cheap, and demolishing them doesn't feel bad. I'm going to dip it into a little bit of terps here, and then just scrub that out. The idea here is that this will soften up the bristles a little before each use. Because like I said earlier, you don't want to scrub the speed paint off the high points of the miniature. So, this is ready to go. We have our fella here. Dip your brush, and then away we go. This is the most terrifying part of the entire process, because it does, honestly, look dreadful going on. There's nothing you can do about it. It looks like an absolute disaster has just unfolded, and yeah, you'd be forgiven for thinking I'd lost the plot and suggesting this. But be pretty generous with it. Really do bucket it on in some areas, and then shift it around with your brush to where it needs to go. So after a few seconds on the miniature, you're going to get an eye for where those big wet patches are going to form, and where the gunk is going to settle. And wherever you need to, you can shift it around with your brush while it is still wet. So, same as with an acrylic wash, you do want to make sure that you're working it into all the nooks and crannies. And then once we're done with this, it is time to leave them somewhere dry and preferably warm for 48 hours at the very least. This is the only part where the dip does take a while to set. Now back here on his cape is a good example of where it is pooling more than I'd like. So what I'm going to do is just scrub out most of the stuff from my brush. I don't want to clean it completely, but just jab those little bubbles to pop those and shift away the excess. Easy as that. So yeah, once this fella is gooped up good and proper, we'll give him 48 hours to dry and then see what we get. And by the time he's dried, he will have magically turned into a Mark II Centurion. Unbelievable as that is. It's not a standard feature of the dip, so if yours doesn't do that, don't be too surprised. Now the difference between freshly applied and left to cure for a few days is massive. I really like how it actually peels back ever so slightly from the edges of some of the flat panels. I think it's a great effect. It does settle differently to how an acrylic wash would, so there is a good reason to use one or the other. But all the same, what we have now is a nice glossy surface. Now, if you are going to apply any decals, what that means is the best time to do it is now. So I've got over here my little parcel of decals that I'm going to wet up and put on the fella. I have had to quite carefully trim some of them to fit. You might have to as well, depending on what miniature you're doing, but for the most part, it's going to be straight off of the transfer sheet. When those have had some time to dry and set properly, you'll see there's still a bit of a shine to them, but that's perfect because we're about to matte varnish them. Now this is a step where you definitely want to make sure you are leaving your miniature to cure for at least the 48 hours that Army Painter recommends, because as I've learned the hard way, if you do it early, the texture that is there, what's going to happen is that the dip that isn't fully cured, when you apply the matte varnish over the top, the matte varnish kind of grips the surface underneath, and as the varnish dries and tightens, what happens is that it's pulling up the surface underneath, and that's why you get those wrinkles and cracks and what have you if it's not completely cured. So this has been 3.5 days worth of drying time. Fingers crossed, let's see what we get. Now, isn't that just a world of difference? In particular, you'll see some of the original color does come through much more clearly. So where this was a brownish finish, once it's matte again, you do get that noble skin showing through. Really, really cool. Very happy with how the inside of it turned out as well. The whole miniature, quite happy with that. Now, if I were looking to get an army on the table very quickly, there's no reason I couldn't base this guy and call him done. But I do want to take this a little bit further and do a bit of extra work. In particular, what I have here, this is warm skin shade. And I'm going to pop just a little bit of this over some of the gold details, because in hindsight, I probably would have liked to wait and get some of the maybe glittering gold or just a different one to break up some of the color on these a little so that it's not just a big field of one colored gold. But all the same, this is purely optional. I'm messing around now. But this will go very well over our matte varnished gold stuff. Now, as for his skin, I do want him to look a little bit unwell, but I don't want him to look like full-on decrepit. So what I've got is a little bit of voodoo shade, and I'm just going to paint this slightly greenish stuff into some of the recesses and hollows, like around his eyes and his temples and what have you. Just enough to give us a little variation in color and make him look, unhappy. Yeah, that's starting to look properly grim. What I'm going to get now is a little bit of true brass, and this is really the secret weapon in this formula. What I'm going to do is, using the edge of my brush for most of this, let's flip them upside down for a second, is just to drag along the edge of some of the gold details to give us a nice sharp highlight. Now, you don't have to do this on everything, and it is possible, I'd say, to overdo it, so mind how you go. But it does introduce another bit of texture to the gold and makes it look a bit more realistic. So along a few bits here and there, like I said, just a quick flick with the edge of your brush. Bit of true brass. Now you can get quite into the woods on that, and the same is going to be true with the silver stuff, because what I've got is plate mail metal. I am going to very lightly just dry brush the edge of his hammer here to reintroduce a bit of silver where some of it has come away a little from the speed paint. This does not take too terribly long, and it brightens this up considerably. Now, if you want to, you can do this painstakingly with a brush and a nice fine tip on your bolter too, but honestly, just a little bit of silver here will do the job. The only one where I'm going to spend a little bit more time and care on highlighting the silver is going to be up on his face, that mask there, which is not going to appear probably on most of your fellas. I'm going to go back to Dorado's skin from earlier and just a little bit of this to accentuate some of the curves in his head, because he has got quite a few of those. So his brow, and let's make him look a little less desiccated. I don't know whether or not I'd bother with this on the Legionaries, but what I have is some fur brown, and I'm going to just lightly catch the edges here of the leather. Now, fur brown's a wonderful color to have in your arsenal. I would recommend having this, whatever it is you're painting. Great one to have handy. It works for loads of stuff. Okay. So what I've done here is I have a little nubbin of packing foam, and I've trimmed it, to quite a point, because on my characters here I want a fair bit of control on how this goes. I'm going to dip this into a little bit of oak brown, and then dab most of it off onto some kitchen towel here, because this is going to be our chipping brush. So just lightly at first, until I get a feel for what and where I'm leaving stuff behind with this. Let's start adding a little bit of damage, some chipping too. Predominantly the white armor, but you can also pop it onto the green as well, just so it doesn't feel too left out, let's say. Now on your characters, you probably don't want to do a huge amount of this, because it will very quickly make them look like they've just gone through the ringer, and not in a cool way. Take your time, And yeah, just a few diblets of this where you want a bit of action. Now, you see what I mean? We want them dinged up, but not completely shattered. What I'm going to do now is grab some white. I've thinned this down a little bit. And instead of completely covering the chipping that we've done, I'm going to use this, just little dots of it, around the edges of the chipping to make it look like it's a slightly more three-dimensional chunk. Now, you don't need to do this on every single bit, because that'll take you a while if you've added quite a bit of it. But it will look intensely cool if you do a few bits of it. Now, this is also a good opportunity if you want to highlight the white. You can do a little bit of this. I would say, try to avoid doing this in a big way on most of you guys. Otherwise, it's going to make those that you haven't stand out. So a few chunks of this here and there, maybe on the banner as well. And as well as doing this with the white, I'm also going to do this using necrotic green on some of the green parts. Now we have quite a cool color scheme. Even the gold is relatively brassy and cool. It's not super orange. So what we'll do to add a little bit of warmth and obviously make them look a little bit more Death Guard. So what I've mixed up here, this is 1 drop of the fresh rust, effects paint, and then 5 drops of the war paint stabilizer, because you want to thin this out. It doesn't necessarily have to be the stabilizer, but I do tend to find it works quite well for making sure that my paint settles where I put it. So add a little bit of this, a few little streaky streaks, and remember that it will very quickly overpower what you're doing. So don't go mad with it. Just a little bit of this into some of the recesses, with 1 or 2 sort of dripping looks as you go. If you need to, you can come back and add more, but it is very difficult to take it off if you've applied too much. So go easy first of all until you've got your eye in, and then when you have, go as nuts as you want. All right, there's our Death Guard character. Let's call him done. What I'm going to do now is to quickly pop a little gloss varnish onto the gems, like I said I would, and then we'll go ahead and base them. And I do just want to show you one quick thing while I'm doing the basing. So once the sand and the first bit of color is dry, what I'm going to do is quite heavily lay on a bit of burning ore. Now this is going to look quite bright going on, but it will dull down just a little as it starts to dry. But I do want bright orange. You'll see I'm not too concerned about it hitting the bit of tank that he's supposed to be standing on, because like I said, I am going to obscure most of that. So over all of the sand, and then once it starts running out on my brush, like this is obviously a bit tricky to get on camera here, but as I start leaving less and less behind, what I'm going to do is start to lightly just jab at the legs and the base of the cloak. So underneath as well, make sure you're getting it fairly roughly. It doesn't matter too much if it doesn't build up the color immediately. You don't want it to just turn orange, but a little bit of this just lightly dabbed along some of the cloak is going to help sell the lived-in look. So again, don't forget his legs. Then with a slightly softer brush, I've got Dorado skin, and I'm going to do the same thing again, but this time concentrating a little bit higher up with my dabbings to make that dust look like it's traveled slightly further. And I would say it's probably too much on my brush. Now, there isn't really a right or wrong way of doing this. Just experiment with what you like the look of, and don't worry if it looks rough. Like the more scattered and weird it looks, the more accurate it's going to look. So over the bottom half of his legs, his cape, his base, on goes this Dorado skin. There we go. Let's paint the rim of his base in a little bit of oak brown, add a couple of tufts, and we're done. And so there at last, through technical difficulties, our Centurion is complete. And that does describe the entire method, start to finish, on pretty much everything we're going to be painting in the army, including, funnily enough, things like the Dreadnoughts, the Predator, the Thud guns, quad launchers. They're all going to be based off the fairly similar method. So I'm quite happy with that result. It does look a little scratchy under the camera, more so than it does in reality. That cloak almost has a sort of velvety texture to it. I like that. I'm happy with that, and I think putting an army like that on the table is going to look the business. So thanks again go to the Army Painter for sponsoring the series, and I am looking forward to mashing up a bunch more of these guys. I think the easiest way to do this is going to be to get them all to the stage where I can dip the entire infantry cadre in one frantic dipping session. We'll see how that pans out. As well, thanks goes to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and as well, all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much, folks. You're actually the ones who are able to help me to get the transfers for this army. So there you go. Tangible benefit there if you've never seen that one mentioned before. So as always, if you've got any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all. And you all enjoy the rest of your day.